Welcome back to the Whispering Hour, where the world sleeps, and stories wake. Tonight's episode takes you somewhere you were never meant to go, into the hollow route outside a fading American town, where the road curves away from the last familiar lights, and where the darkness listens more closely to your memories. Now, let's begin. Some places in America don't scare you when you look at them, they scare you when you realize how stubbornly ordinary they're pretending to be. My aunt's house sat on a gentle rise on the edge of town, white paint peeling in long curls, porch sagging, a single maple tree leaning toward the roof as if eavesdropping. From the road it looked like any other tired small-town house that had watched too many winters pass by. The only thing that set it apart was the driveway, the way it curved down and out toward the hollow route instead of toward the main road, like whoever built it had decided the house should face something the rest of the town preferred to ignore. When my aunt's health started slipping and I moved back to take care of the place, everyone in town told me the same thing in slightly different words: good on you for being there for her. I wouldn't sleep in that house, though. Not with it turned toward that road. They said it with the half-laugh people use when they want to pretend they aren't serious. But their eyes always flicked toward the direction of the hollow route when they did. The first few nights, I didn't feel anything except the familiar weight of being back in a house that had seen me grow up in flashes: Thanksgiving visits, hurried summer stays, those awkward teenage years where everything smelled like dust and old coffee and adult disappointment. The floorboards still remembered where my uncle used to stand in the kitchen, leaning his weight too heavily in one spot. They creaked differently there, a slightly lower pitch. The wallpaper was still patterned with a design that had never been in style, faded now into something almost abstract. My aunt's room smelled faintly of medicine and the lavender detergent she'd sworn by for 30 years. The house wasn't haunted in any obvious way. No cold spots that made your breath show, no footsteps in empty hallways. Just a kind of dense quiet in certain corners, a sensation like those corners were aware of being corners, and resented being ignored. The first change came from the windows facing the hollow route. During the day, they were fine, glass a little cloudy from age, frames a little swollen from years of humidity, but at night, when the porch light clicked off and the fields beyond turned to a soft, featureless dark, those windows stopped reflecting the interior of the room the way they should have. I noticed it one evening when I walked through the living room with a cup of coffee. The lamp behind me should have painted a clear outline of my shoulders on the glass. Instead, the window showed the faint glow of a different light source, something low and distant, as though there were another room pressed up against the other side of the glass, lit by a bulb too dim to identify. I stared for a long time, trying to catch my own reflection, but it was like looking through a one-way mirror that had forgotten which side it was meant to privilege. Only when I stepped back far enough that I could see the glass at an angle, did my face slide into existence, laid and slightly off-center, as if it had been added on top of something more important. I wrote it off as fatigue and old glass. Most people who move back to a town they thought they'd left for good spend the first month blaming everything on fatigue. But the house had a way of repeating anything you refused to acknowledge. A few nights later, I woke around 3 in the morning to the soft impression that someone had said my name, not loudly, not even clearly, just the faintest suggestion of syllables brushing past my ear. I sat up, heart heavy and fast, listening. The house settled in its bones. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere inside the walls, a pipe ticked as it cooled. Nothing else. I lay back down, feeling foolish, but as I stared at the ceiling, the shadows shifted. Not randomly, not in the drifting way passing headlights would cause. They shifted as though the angle of the light source outside had changed, except every clock in the house agreed it was still the dead center of the night. The next morning, when I mentioned it to my aunt over tea, her eyes went distant in a way I hadn't seen before. "That house has been trying to wake up for years," she said quietly. "We just got good at talking over it." After that, I started noticing small dislocations. The narrow hallway between my bedroom and the bathroom seemed longer on some nights and shorter on others, even though the walls never actually moved. I'd walk it in the dark and misjudge the distance, reaching for the bathroom door too soon, my hand hitting empty air. Other times, I'd feel the cool metal of the doorknob under my palm one step earlier than I expected. It was nothing dramatic, never enough to make me fall or stumble badly, just enough to make my brain file away a quiet note, pay closer attention. The worst part was, when I stood there counting steps in the daylight, everything was perfectly normal. It was only at night, when the lights were off and the windows facing the hollow route reflected too much darkness, that the measurements refused to behave. The dream started soon after. Not the usual kind where your mind chews on the leftovers of your day. These were colder, cleaner, like someone else's thoughts projected into my sleep. I'd dream of walking down that hallway, except it never ended. The floorboards went on, repeating patterns of nail heads and scuffs, the walls narrowing by a fraction of an inch every few yards. Doors appeared on either side, dozens of them, all identical, all closed. And behind each door, I could hear something faint, as if a radio were playing inside every room, tuned to different frequencies. Some crackled with static. Others carried soft, monotonous voices reciting lists of numbers or names. One seemed to hold nothing but the sound of my own heartbeat, echoing back at me twice as loud as it should have been. In the dream, I knew I couldn't open any of them. Not because something terrible would escape, but because whatever was inside each room had something I wasn't ready to learn about myself. I'd wake up with my hand on the bedroom doorknob, fingers already tightening around it as if I'd been about to step into the hallway in my sleep. The first time it happened, I laughed it off, told myself I'd just been restless. The second time, I found myself not at the bedroom door but halfway down the actual hall, barefoot, heart racing, the house dark around me. The third time, I woke standing in front of the living room window that faced the hollow route, staring through glass so black I couldn't tell where my reflection ended and the outside began. I hadn't turned any lights on. The only glow came from somewhere down the hollow route itself, a faint, low light that seemed too still to be headlights and too focused to be moonlight. What disturbed me most wasn't that the house had led me there in my sleep. It was that, for a moment, I had the distinct feeling I'd been talking to someone before I woke. Not out loud, not in the house, inside. The way you sometimes realize you've been arguing with a thought for several minutes without being aware of it. Except this time, the thought had another voice woven through it, like two recordings played over each other slightly out of sync. I started keeping the television on at night, volume low, just enough noise to blur the edges of the silence. The house seemed to resent it. The first night I tried, the power flickered twice, not enough to shut everything down but enough to make the screen jump. The second night, the volume slider moved on its own, climbing upward with slow, jerky steps until a commercial blared loud enough to make me flinch. Maybe the remote had jammed, maybe I'd rolled onto it. Houses can't dislike sound, I told myself. They can't prefer quiet. That would mean they cared, and wood and wiring don't care. Then came the evening the hollow route drove something to the house, instead of the other way around. It was close to midnight, the sky stretched out in a flat, lightless sheet beyond the tree line. I was sitting at the kitchen table, half listening to the murmur of late-night talk radio, when I heard tires on gravel in the driveway. They rolled slowly, hesitated, then stopped. No one ever came here that late unless something was wrong. I stood, heart already ticking a little faster, and moved to the front window. A car idled in the drive, a dark sedan I didn't recognize. The interior light wasn't on. The windows were tinted enough that I couldn't see the driver. I waited for a knock that didn't come. The longer I watched, the more wrong the scene felt. The engine sound didn't quite match the car's size. It was too low, too faint, almost like the noise was coming from a recording rather than a mechanical object in front of the house. After what felt like 5 solid minutes but might have been less, the car door opened. A figure stepped out, tall, coat hanging straight down, head turned slightly toward the hollow route instead of toward the house. He started walking up the path, not with the hesitation of someone unsure of their welcome, but with the slow, measured pace of someone following directions they'd already heard before. I opened the door halfway, ready to ask if he needed help, but the words evaporated. His face was wrong. Not monstrous, just off in a way that made it hard to hold on to your thoughts. His features looked like someone had assembled them from memory and missed a few details. Eyes a fraction too close together. Mouth set a little too low. skin tone that didn't quite match the hands emerging from his sleeves. Every part was plausible on its own, but together they made a pattern my brain wanted to reject. He stopped at the bottom step and looked up at me, his head tilting to one side with a slow curiosity. "You've been hearing it, haven't you?" he asked. His voice didn't fit either, it sounded normal, even kind, but there was a flatness behind the words, as if the tone had been chosen rather than felt. I swallowed, tried to keep my expression neutral. "Hearing what?" "The house," he said, as if that were the simplest answer in the world. "It's loud when you're quiet, that's why you're leaving the radio on." It took me a second to respond. The radio was low enough that no one outside should have noticed it. "How do you know that?" He blinked slowly, too slowly. "You drove the hollow route this afternoon," he said. "You brought it back with you. It needs somewhere to stay that isn't the road. Houses are easier. Less movement to keep track of." My skin prickled. There were at least 6 different reasons to shut the door and call the sheriff right then. Something in the way he stared at the doorway, though, made me hesitate. It wasn't me he was focused on, it was the space behind me, the darkness pooling in the hall, the quiet thrum of the house itself. "I think you have the wrong place," I said, keeping my hand on the edge of the door. He smiled, and the gesture didn't touch his eyes. "No," he said softly. "It chose right. You already have the cracks, it likes that." The overhead light flickered then, once, in a brief, sharp stutter that made the shadows jump. In that split second of half-darkness, his shape seemed to blur, not vanish, not move, just lose definition, like my brain had lost its grip on what it was seeing. When the light steadied, he was still there, standing in the same place, but the porch boards beneath his feet looked slightly warped, as if they were bending to support a weight they hadn't been designed for. "I shouldn't have followed it this far," he added, more to himself than to me. "It remembers better when it has an address." I don't remember deciding to shut the door. One moment I was standing there staring at him, the next the wood was between us and my hand was turning the deadbolt with a speed that bordered on panic. The house seemed to exhale with me, the air in the hallway shifting as though every room had adjusted itself by an inch. He didn't knock, he didn't try the handle. He stayed on the porch long enough that I could feel his presence through the door. Then the sound of his footsteps moved away, slower than normal, each board complaining a little more than it should have, and the car's engine rolled back into that flattened, too distant hum. I waited at the window, but when I finally gathered the nerve to look out again, the driveway was empty. No tire tracks disturbed the thin layer of dust on the gravel. After that night, the house stopped bothering with subtlety. The shadows that had once stretched the wrong way began to appear, where no light source could have created them at all. Whole corners of rooms went soft at the edges, like the world's focus had slipped. Sometimes, when I stood in the kitchen and stared through the window at the hollow route, I had the distinct feeling that the road and the house were connected by something I couldn't see, a shared memory, a shared attention. The same way you can feel when 2 people in a room are thinking about the same thing without speaking it. The worst moment, the one that finally convinced me I couldn't stay, came a week later. I woke in the middle of the night, heart pounding, convinced I could hear someone whispering in the next room. The words were indistinct, rising and falling in a rhythm that sounded almost like breathing. I got up slowly, crossed the hall, and opened my aunt's old bedroom door. The bed was empty, the lamp beside it was off. The whispering continued. It took me a full 10 seconds to realize it wasn't coming from the room at all. It was coming from the walls. Not through them, not from outside. From inside their thickness, as if the house had learned enough of my thoughts to try stitching together its own attempt at a voice. And underneath it all, quieter but clearer, was another sound, the low, steady pulse of something like traffic far away. Except the hollow route was empty at that hour. I knew it, I felt it. The road's silence carried all the way to the house. Yet somehow, I could hear it inside the plaster, like the memory of tires on asphalt had lodged itself there and refused to leave. I moved out the next morning. Packed what I could, locked the door, and left the keys with a lawyer who specialized in properties nobody wanted to keep. I don't know what's happened to the house since. People say it's still standing, still facing the hollow route, still blinking its windows at night as though trying to focus on whatever passes. Sometimes, when I drive through town and catch the faintest glimpse of the old place on the hill, every window looks dark and flat. But if the light hits just right, I swear I can see something in the glass, not my reflection, not the sky, not the fields. It looks like a hallway with doors on either side, stretching far beyond what the interior of that house should allow. Some roads change the way you see the world outside, some houses change the way you hear the world inside. And there are places where the two of them meet, quietly, patiently, waiting for someone with just enough cracks to let both in at once. There are stretches of American highway where the night feels heavier than the darkness can explain, places where the quiet doesn't just settle, it waits. I've spent most of my adult life out on those roads, working the late shift for a towing company that covers 3 counties and the sliver of backroads between them. People picture tow truck work as breakneck rescues and adrenaline, but the truth is most nights are spent listening to the soft hum of diesel, watching the white line roll beneath the headlights, and waiting for the radio to crackle with someone else's bad luck. My name isn't important, what matters is that I've picked cars off ditches, hauled engines half frozen in snow, and dragged more broken-down sedans off old rural routes than I care to count. But no stretch of pavement ever stayed with me the way the hollow route did, and even after all these years, I still don't like to say that name out loud. The first call I ever got from that road came on a late November night, the kind where the cold sticks to the inside of your coat even with the heater blowing. I remember staring at the radio when dispatch said the location, because the hollow route wasn't on my regular patrol list and hardly ever saw traffic. People avoided it the way you avoid old houses you don't want to admit spook you. The voice on the other end belonged to a young man who sounded winded, like he couldn't tell whether he was scared or cold. He kept insisting his car had simply stopped running, no grinding, no warning, no lights. Just silence. I had heard all kinds of reasons for breakdowns, but the way he said it, like the car hadn't died so much as gone quiet, settled wrong in my chest. It took me 15 minutes to reach the turnoff, and another few to guide the truck onto that narrow 2-lane road. The tree line pressed close on both sides, and the darkness seemed thick enough to press against the windshield. The headlights cut a narrow path ahead, but everything beyond them felt too still, as if even the wind refused to move through that stretch. I found the young man's car near the mile marker, 1.3, parked at a slant on the shoulder. He hadn't mentioned the marker in his call, but I noticed it immediately, something about the way it leaned inward toward the road, as though the sign were listening. The man stood outside the car hugging himself through a thin jacket. I asked if he was hurt. He shook his head too quickly and told me the car had shut off without explanation. When I checked under the hood, everything looked wrong in a way I couldn't diagnose, like every component had done exactly what it was supposed to until the moment it hadn't. I hooked up the tow and tried to keep the conversation light, but he kept glancing at the mile marker with a tightness in his jaw that didn't match simple worry. Eventually he cleared his throat and said, "I thought I saw someone standing beside it right before the engine died." I asked him to be more specific, but he went quiet again, shaking his head, repeating that maybe he'd been tired, maybe it had been the angle of the headlights. I didn't press him. I wanted to believe that explanation as badly as he did. 2 weeks later, another call came from the hollow route. This one was from a woman whose SUV had lost all electrical power. No headlights, no dashboard, not even the emergency flashers. She had pulled to the shoulder by instinct, stopping only because she couldn't see anything past her windshield. When I reached her, she was still sitting upright in the driver's seat with her hands locked on the wheel. She didn't wait for me to speak before saying, "It wasn't a person." I know what I saw, and it wasn't a person. I told her I was just there to help, but she didn't drift toward conversation the way people usually do once they've passed the first wave of fear. She kept staring at the dark line of trees across the road, her voice barely above a whisper as she added, "It wanted to be seen." That's the part that scared me. Her SUV came back to life the moment I towed it off the hollow route. Before I even unhooked it at the shop, the headlights flicked on, the dashboard lit, and the radio blared to life as if someone had turned a switch back on. The mechanic couldn't find anything wrong. When I told the sheriff about it, he nodded once and said, "That road's been strange a long time." He didn't elaborate, and I didn't ask. But the call that stayed with me, the one that finally made me understand why locals said the hollow route had a personality, happened in mid-January, when ice rimed the edges of the ditches and the cold felt sharp enough to crack. Dispatch said a sedan had been reported stopped on the east side, near the same 1.3 marker. No driver visible, no hazard lights. The report came from a trucker who'd passed through. He hadn't stopped because he didn't like the look of the place. I could hardly blame him. When I arrived, I saw the car immediately, its taillights cold, its windows fogged lightly from the inside. The mile marker stood only a few feet away, leaning slightly more than I remembered. For a moment, I thought the driver might be inside the car, slumped forward out of view. I knocked on the window, no answer. When I opened the door, the interior was empty. The dome light flickered once, then steadied. The keys sat in the ignition. A faint warmth still lingered on the steering wheel, like someone had stepped out only minutes earlier. There were footprints leading away from the car, but they didn't head toward the trees or down the road. They curved toward the marker. And then they stopped. I don't mean they turned back or faded. I mean they stopped. One final imprint in the dirt, toes angled toward the sign, and nothing beyond it. The air shifted subtly around me, a faint change in the weight of the night. I don't scare easily, you lose that instinct working roadside jobs in the dark. But something about that last footprint, that way it ended at the base of the marker, made the small hair at the back of my neck rise. I took a slow step backward, then another. The silence stretched, deep and unmoving, until it felt like even my breathing might be too loud. I radioed the sheriff, told him the driver wasn't on scene. He didn't sound surprised. "Stay in your truck," he said. "I'm sending someone out." His voice carried a note I'd never heard from him before, a kind of quiet urgency edged with caution. When I sat back in my truck, I couldn't stop watching the marker. It looked ordinary from a distance, but the longer I stared, the more a strange impression settled in, like the sign wasn't standing still, but leaning in just slightly, the angle tightening by degrees. When the sheriff arrived, he didn't park near me. He stayed back several yards and motioned for me to do the same. We approached the car together, and he checked inside, confirming what I had seen: still warm seats, still no sign of the driver. He shone his flashlight at the marker, and for a moment the beam bent in a way light shouldn't bend, as though it were being pulled inward. The sheriff clicked the light off almost immediately. "Don't look too long," he muttered. "That one remembers faces." I wanted to ask what he meant, but something in the tightness of his jaw made me keep the question to myself. We walked the scene, searched for any sign the driver had gone into the brush, but the earth held no prints after that last one. It was as if the man had stepped toward the sign and vanished. The sheriff eventually radioed for a missing person report. We towed the sedan away, and the farther we got from the hollow route, the more the weight in my chest eased, like a hand had finally unclenched around my ribs. I didn't return to that road for nearly 2 months. I switched shifts with another driver whenever the dispatch location pointed even close to that route. He never complained, though more than once he came back quiet, pale, saying things like, "That road doesn't like being ignored," or "The markers don't stay put." I chalked it up to nerves, or maybe the stories had gotten into his head the way they had gotten into mine. But deep down I knew better. Some places don't need belief to have influence, they just need you to step into the space where the rules thin out. The last call I ever took from the hollow route came that spring, after the thaw had turned the ditches soft and the trees had begun to leaf out again. A stranded pickup, engine dead. Driver unresponsive to calls. I almost refused outright, but the dispatcher sounded stressed, and I knew I couldn't send someone else without explaining why. So I drove out, the old dread settling in my stomach the moment I passed the faint curve in the tree line. The pickup sat near the same stretch of road, 1.3 again, of course, with its hood open and the driver sitting on the ground beside it. He wasn't injured, he wasn't panicked. He was staring at the marker with a stillness that felt worse than fear. I approached carefully, calling out his name, and he blinked like someone waking from a long dream. When I asked what had happened, he rubbed his face with both hands and whispered, "I thought it was my brother." He waved to me. I felt my throat go dry. "Your brother here?" I asked, even though I already sensed the answer. The man shook his head slowly. "He died 5 years ago." His voice cracked. "But he looked alive. He looked young." I didn't let him finish. I guided him toward my truck, told him to sit inside and keep the door shut. When I turned back toward the marker, the light hit it in a way that made the numbers gleam bright and cold. And for just a breath, I thought I saw a shape behind the reflection. Tall, slanted, leaning forward like someone listening at a door. I didn't look again. We towed the pickup off the hollow route, and just like always, the moment we reached the main road, the engine sputtered back to life. The driver started crying quietly, murmuring apologies into his hands. I didn't know who they were for, maybe he didn't either. I turned in my resignation 2 weeks later. People asked why, and I told them I was tired, that years of late shifts had worn me down. But the truth is simpler, no job is worth standing on a road that shows you the faces you've lost, wearing expressions you were never meant to see again. Something lives in the space between the mile markers on the hollow route. Something pays attention, something remembers, and it doesn't always wait for you to call for help. There are nights in small towns when silence carries weight, not the peaceful kind people imagine when they picture quiet rural living, but the heavy kind that comes after too many years of knowing exactly what can go wrong when the world gets still. I have lived in towns like that my entire life, places where the sheriff's office operates out of a repurposed real estate building and the dispatch desk sits close enough to the holding cell that you can hear the hum of the lights from both at the same time. I was the night shift deputy for 3 years, a job that sounds more dramatic than it usually is. Most nights were a slow drift of paperwork, half-hearted patrols, and checking the traffic cameras mounted along the outskirts of the county. Those feeds were supposed to help us track drunk drivers or stolen vehicles, but more often than not, they showed little more than empty roads stretching toward darker empty roads. The hollow route had 2 cameras on it, though no one in the department ever explained why the county insisted on installing them there. It wasn't a major throughway, it wasn't funded for expansion, and the whole stretch barely showed up on updated maps. But the cameras were there, one at the edge of the turnoff, one near the midpoint, both old but maintained, both pointed at a part of the county no one liked talking about. I'd been told during training that if either of those feeds went out, I should call the highway department instead of trying to reset anything myself. When I asked why, the sheriff just rubbed his jaw and said, "Because you don't want to find out what's wrong with them firsthand." I thought he meant raccoons or weather damage. He didn't correct me. On the night it happened, the weather was clear but restless, the kind of wind that rattles gutter pipes and makes you think a storm is coming, even when the sky holds itself taut and empty. I had the night desk mostly to myself, just me, a thermos of coffee that had lost its heat an hour earlier, and the soft hum of the monitors lined up in front of me. I had gotten used to the rhythm of those screens, the faint shifts of headlights, the occasional truck rolling through the main road, the long stretches where nothing moved at all. I wasn't used to hollow route holding still for so long. The camera feeds usually showed something, a sway of tree shadows, a flicker from a passing car. That night, both screens were too still, frozen in a way that felt intentional rather than technical. I checked the connection twice. No errors, no drop in power. The feeds were live. They just weren't showing anything that moved. I leaned back, rubbed the tiredness from my eyes, and watched the first feed again. The camera perched above the turnoff showed the familiar narrow entryway, marked by a faded sign and the start of the tree line. The wind must have been catching the branches, but the shadows didn't sway the way they should have. They stretched across the road in long, dark bars that seemed positioned rather than cast. The second feed, the midpoint, showed the same eerie stillness. The mile marker in view, 1.2, stood at a slant I'd noticed before, as though the ground beneath it had shifted and no one had bothered to straighten it. That marker always bothered me. It didn't help that every once in a while, you'd overhear someone in town mention that the signs on that road weren't where they used to be. When you asked for clarification, people would shrug and say things like, they move when they want to, which is the sort of answer small-town folks give when they want to be believed without being questioned. I took another sip of lukewarm coffee and leaned forward, meaning to log the strange stillness and move on. But then the first feed flickered. Not a full-screen glitch, just a soft ripple in the image. As though the camera lens had dipped underwater for half a second. I frowned and tapped the monitor lightly with the back of my knuckle. The feed steadied, and then the second camera flickered in the same way. That alone wouldn't have been enough to unsettle me, except that this time something appeared on the edge of the frame, just a small shape, low to the ground, almost the height of a person crouched with their head bent. It moved in a slow, dragging way, not toward the road but beside it, following the ditch line as though keeping the pavement in sight without stepping fully onto it. I sat up straighter. The resolution wasn't great, county cameras rarely are. But the shape moved with a kind of deliberate slowness that didn't match any animal I'd seen out there. I turned the brightness up, though the adjustment only sharpened the shadows. Whatever it was, it crept past the edge of the frame without ever lifting itself fully upright. Something about that posture chilled me, a wrongness in the way it hugged the ground, like a person trying to imitate movement they didn't quite understand. I switched back to the first camera. It showed only the turnoff and the faint suggestion of asphalt vanishing into the dark. A few minutes passed, the kind that stretch longer than they should when you're waiting for an answer you know won't be good. I was considering sending a patrol car out when the second camera flickered again. The image dragged sideways like the digital feed had been pulled taut and released. And then I saw something that made me grip the edge of the desk hard enough my knuckles ached. The mile marker, 1.2, was missing. The grass where it had stood was bare. No sign of the bent post or the reflective panel. I blinked, leaned closer, wiped a hand across the screen to clear a smudge that wasn't actually there. Still gone. The camera angle was fixed, there was no way the sign had simply slipped out of view. Something had moved it, or taken it, without disturbing anything around it. The road itself looked unchanged, the tree shadows still stretched in those odd, unmoving lines. I checked the timestamp on the recording. The camera hadn't cut out, there were no gaps. One frame showed the sign, the next did not. I radioed the sheriff, though I hesitated before describing the problem. He listened quietly on the other end of the line, and after a long pause said, "Leave it alone for now, just watch." That wasn't the advice I wanted, but the tone he used left no room for argument. I set the radio down and turned back to the monitors with a sense of dread building behind my ribs. The first camera feed remained eerily still, but on the second feed, motion finally appeared. A person, or something uncomfortably close to a person, was walking down the center of the hollow route. They kept to a steady pace, head down, arms hanging too loosely at their sides. The camera quality blurred the details, but what I could see didn't match anything normal. The height looked right for an adult, but the posture was slouched to the point where the shoulders nearly folded forward. Each step landed softly, like the figure was trying not to be heard. There was no accompanying shadow from headlights, no glow from a distant car. Whoever this was had started their walk in darkness. They stopped when they reached the spot where the 1.2 marker should have been. Their head lifted, and I had the strong impression they were staring directly into the camera, though the angle shouldn't have allowed it. For a long moment, nothing moved at all, not the trees, not the figure, not even the faint static on the feed. Then the person stepped out of frame to the right, and the camera flickered hard enough that the whole monitor went black for a full second. When it came back online, the mile marker was standing again, but not where it had been. It now leaned on the opposite side of the road, propped slightly inward as though someone had pressed it into place, without quite aligning the post. I scrubbed the feed backward, frame by frame, expecting to see someone dragging it or dropping it, but the moment between disappearance and reappearance held only glitch distortion, no movement, no shape, no explanation. The sheriff's words echoed in my head. "Leave it alone." But I couldn't. I switched to the first camera again. The turnoff still looked deceptively calm. Except now there was something faint reflected in the asphalt, a pale smear of light too low to be headlights and too steady to be moonlight. It stretched across the pavement as though coming from deeper along the route, a glow without a source. I zoomed in as far as the old equipment allowed. The road was empty. No figure, no car, no animal, just that faint, quiet glow laying across the asphalt like a memory of something that had already passed. The radio crackled behind me, and I jumped hard enough that my chair scraped the floor. Dispatch patched through a caller who sounded out of breath, unsure, a little shaken. She said she had been driving home from a late shift and had seen a person standing in the middle of the hollow route, except when she slowed down, there was no one there, just the shine of a mile marker reflecting her headlights in a place where she swore no mile marker had ever stood before. She kept insisting that the sign had been closer to the center line than the shoulder, leaning toward her car as she passed, almost as if it were trying to get her attention. When the call ended, I sat there staring at the monitors, watching the faint grain of the feed move like dust caught in moonlight. The figure didn't return, the sign didn't move again. The light stretched across the road faded slowly, the way a shadow fades when the sun ducks behind clouds. The wind outside picked up, and for the first time all night I saw the tree branches sway, as though whatever stilled them earlier had finally loosened its grip. Around 3 in the morning, the sheriff stopped by the station. He didn't ask to see the footage, he didn't ask what I had witnessed. He just set a fresh cup of coffee beside me and said, "You're on highways tomorrow. Someone else will take the desk for a few nights." When I opened my mouth to ask why, he cut me off with a shake of his head. "Because once you see the hollow route watching back, you need a little distance. It doesn't forget faces quickly." I thought he was exaggerating, but 2 nights later, when I drove past the turnoff on my way home, the 1.2 marker, a sign I had seen upright and unmoving for years, was tilted at a sharper angle than before, as though it had turned slightly to track drivers passing in the dark. I can't explain how a metal post gives the impression of paying attention, but some things don't require logic to be understood. You feel it, you know it. I never watched the hollow route feeds again, not directly. I let other deputies take the desk shift. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about the figure walking down the center of that road. I wonder whether it had once been a person or whether it was something the road made out of shadows and stillness. I wonder why it needed the mile marker moved, or why it bothered putting it back. And sometimes, when the night is quiet in that heavy small-town way, I wonder how many faces the hollow route has watched over the years, and how many of them it still remembers. Some work sounds safe on paper, almost boring in the way people who don't know better think they want their lives to be. County surveyor sounded like that when I first signed the papers: drive the backroads, measure distance, confirm what the map already says is true, go home. I liked that idea more than I wanted to admit. There's something comforting about living in a world where you can point at a line on a page and say, this is exactly how far it goes. For most of my career, it was true. Roads behaved. Numbers lined up. Distances stayed the same every time you checked them. It wasn't exciting, but it was solid. It kept my mind busy enough that the other thoughts, the ones I didn't like to look at directly, stayed in the background where they belonged. That changed the week the hollow route landed on my assignment list and refused to fit on the map, the way everything else always had. I'd heard the name before in casual tones at the office, usually with the kind of shrug people use when they pretend not to care about something they very clearly avoid. Old connector, they'd say. Nobody really uses it anymore. Or, if they were being honest and forgot I was in the room, that damn road again. Once, when I asked why no one wanted to take it, my supervisor just gave me a tired half smile and said, because it doesn't like being told what it is. I laughed, expecting the punchline, but he only turned back to his paperwork. After that, I decided the hollow route was nothing more than a collection of small-town stories glued onto a stretch of pavement, that bored people wanted to make interesting. The morning I went out there, the sky had that flat Midwestern light that makes it impossible to tell what time it is by looking up. The trees along the edge of the road were still bare from winter, their branches clawing at the sky like veins. As soon as my tires left the main highway and rolled onto the hollow route, I felt the difference in the sound of the engine. It didn't get louder or quieter, exactly, it just felt like the noise had less space to go. The air around the truck swallowed it faster, as if the world here had thicker walls. I parked just past the first bend, shut off the engine, and listened. No distant traffic, no birds, just a kind of flat silence that reminded me of the way a house sounds after someone moves out, same walls, same rooms, but something essential missing from the air. I checked my measuring wheel, adjusted the strap of my clipboard, and stepped out onto the pavement. The first few steps felt perfectly normal. I'd done this dozens of times. Mark the starting point, reset the counter, walk until the wheel reached 1/10 of a mile. Note the marker, confirm, repeat. The routine had become so ingrained over the years that my body could do it even while my mind chewed on other things, bills, family, the slow erosion of whatever social life I'd had into a rhythm of work and tired evenings. But as I moved down the hollow route toward the first marker, I realized something was interfering with that background hum of thought. There was a false clarity in my head, like my own mind had gone louder inside my skull. Every breath sounded deliberate, every thought arrived sharply instead of drifting in. There was no soft blur to anything. The 1.0 marker came into view exactly where it was supposed to be. Clean paint, straight post, reflective surface that caught the dull morning light in a precise, controlled way. I logged its coordinates, measured the distance from the start, compared numbers. Perfect match. If anything, it was too perfect. The county hardly spent money on minor markers anymore. We had stretches of popular highway where the signs leaned like drunks and no one bothered fixing them. But here, on this forgotten little strip, someone had replaced 1.0 not long ago. The bolts were new, the base was neat. It was the kind of detail you only notice when your whole job is noticing things. Past that point, the change happened gradually. The trees leaned inward just enough to make the sky feel narrower. The air had no particular smell yet, but there was a weight to it, like humidity without moisture. I counted my steps out of habit, 1, 2, 3, 4, while the wheel ticked steadily beside me. My thoughts began to drift, but not in the comfortable way they usually did. They didn't wander, they doubled back. Small, half-formed worries I'd had over the past few months resurfaced in sharper focus, the way I sometimes lost track of time during routine drives home, how I'd catch myself staring at my own hands and feeling, for half a second, that they didn't quite belong to me. The weird pressure headaches that came on when I was surrounded by too much silence. I'd always written them off as stress, aging, lack of sleep. Out here, those thoughts didn't slip away when I dismissed them. They stayed and waited calmly for me to pay closer attention. At the distance where 1.1 should have stood, there was nothing. I checked the shoulder. Nothing had been knocked over or uprooted. I examined the ditch, no scrap of metal, no broken post. Just bare soil with thin grass, as though nothing had ever been placed there at all. I checked my notes again, running the numbers twice. According to the last survey, the marker had existed. According to my eyes, it did not. I turned to look back down the stretch I just walked, expecting some visual cue. Maybe I'd misjudged, maybe the slope of the road had tricked me, but all I saw was the 1.0 marker in the distance, thin and upright, looking now like the period at the end of a sentence I hadn't meant to finish that soon. I told myself markers get stolen. It wasn't unheard of. People collected strange things. Teenagers liked to take souvenirs. But as I passed the spot and kept walking, my steps didn't fall back into their usual rhythm. They felt half a second off, as if the beat had shifted and I hadn't adjusted. My own internal voice began to speak louder inside my head, narrating my movement in a way that felt detached. Step, push the wheel, breathe, write it down later. It was like listening to a recording of myself instead of being myself. The 1.2 marker appeared farther down than I expected, a slim green sliver leaning slightly toward the road. Its surface looked normal at first glance, just another reflective panel waiting to tell someone where they were. Then I got close enough to see my own reflection in it. For a heartbeat, nothing seemed off. I saw my face, my jacket, the shape of the measuring wheel. Then my reflected eyes blinked a fraction of a second after I did. The delay was tiny, almost nothing, but it grabbed my attention like a scream would have in any other setting. I stayed there longer than I should have, testing it. I raised my hand, the reflection followed, but just a little too slow, like it had to think about what movement should look like. My mouth twitched, the reflection's expression dragged behind. It corrected itself when I stepped back, snapping back into perfect synchronization like a loop closing. The surface was just metal and coating, I told myself. Light, angle, fatigue. There had to be an explanation that didn't involve roads noticing you noticing them. I measured anyway, distance from 1.0 to 1.2, wrong. Off by more than a simple maintenance error should allow. I wrote it down, though the numbers felt meaningless. The more I tried to prove things were out of line, the more the hollow route seemed to listen. The stretch toward 1.3 felt like walking into a hallway inside my own head. The trees on either side blurred into vertical lines. The pavement seemed perfectly flat, and yet under my boots it felt tilted in small, nauseating ways, as if the whole world were turning very slowly and I was the only thing trying to stay level. My thoughts, usually layered, some practical, some wandering, some half asleep, flattened. They arrived one at a time, each taking center stage with uncomfortable clarity. The fear that I was becoming forgetful like my father had in his last years. The suspicion that the moments where I couldn't remember leaving a room weren't as innocent as I wanted them to be. The quiet resentment I felt toward the normal, boring life I'd claimed to want. The road took each of those thoughts and turned them just enough to make them sharper. By the time I saw the 1.3 marker ahead, my breathing had become deliberate in a way it shouldn't have needed to be. The post leaned farther than 1.2, its base appearing solid even though the tilt seemed like gravity should have pulled it down already. The green panel caught the gray light, not with a clean reflection but with a slow, dark shine, as if there was depth behind it. When my face appeared this time, I braced myself for the delay, for the wrongness in posture. But what unsettled me wasn't a mismatch. It was the accuracy, everything looked exactly right, except for my eyes. They were too still, too intent, too aware. Then the view shifted, not like reflection changing but like a curtain being pulled back. My face vanished. The surface showed a narrow room that could have been anywhere and nowhere, plain walls, a single metal chair bolted to the floor, a table with rounded edges. It was the kind of room designed for difficult conversations, though I'd never sat in one like it myself. The lighting came from nowhere I could see. It reminded me instantly of my worst private fear, one I'd never spoken aloud, not dying, not being hurt, but losing my hold on what was real and waking up one day in a place built to contain people whose minds had slipped too far. As I watched, someone sat in the chair. It was me and not me. Same face, but slack at the edges, eyes unfocused, posture hollow. The version of me in that room stared at the table like it contained all the answers he no longer wanted. My stomach rolled. The air around the marker felt like it had dropped 10 degrees. On the edge of my hearing I could almost make out a sound, maybe the faint buzz of fluorescent lighting, maybe my own blood moving too loudly. The me in the reflection turned his head slowly toward where I stood in the road. His eyes lifted, and they were wrong. Not monstrous, just empty. The kind of empty that comes from giving up on ever reconciling what's inside your head with what's happening outside it. Then, so quietly it was nothing more than a shape of words forming, his mouth moved. I couldn't hear the sentence, but I recognized the pattern of it, because I had thought it myself on nights when I lay awake staring at the ceiling. What if this is the version of me that's real, and everything else is the dream? I jerked back, sucking in a breath like I'd been underwater. The room vanished. The marker looked ordinary again, green and white, a piece of metal hammered into the dirt and forgotten. Only my hands shaking gave away that anything had happened. My mind scrambled to explain, stress, unresolved grief, some old anxiety bubbling up, but the logic felt thin, like cheap paint over a deep crack in the wall. I finished the survey mechanically. The numbers didn't make sense. Distances stretched or shortened depending on which direction I walked them. The wheel stopped clicking for stretches, then caught up all at once. At one point I thought I heard someone walking in step with me on the other side of the trees, but when I paused, the sound didn't fade, it stopped exactly when I did. There were no birds the entire time I was on the hollow route. I didn't realize how strange that was until I heard one call faintly as I stepped back toward the main road, like the natural world had been holding its breath and had finally been allowed to exhale. Back at the office, I laid the clipboard on my supervisor's desk and waited for him to ask why the numbers didn't match. He didn't, he barely glanced at the inconsistencies before closing the folder. "That's enough," he said. "You won't be assigned to that stretch again." I wanted to ask him what he'd seen in his years with the county, whether the road had shown him reflections like it had shown me, whether other surveyors had come back quieter, more cautious, a little less convinced of the solidity of their own minds. But his expression made it clear we were both choosing not to talk about the same thing. Nights are harder now. It's not that I see the hollow route every time I close my eyes. It's that I feel the version of myself sitting in that featureless room just behind whatever I happen to be doing. Washing dishes, locking the front door, staring at the faint double reflection of my face in a dark television screen. There's always a second version in the back of my head, still sitting at that steel table, waiting to see whether I manage to walk my life in a straight enough line to avoid eventually becoming him. Sometimes I still have to drive past the turnoff. The county is full of small connections that make avoiding it impossible, without adding an hour to every trip. When I do, I keep my eyes locked on the main highway, but out of the corner of my vision I always catch the same sliver of green through the trees, just beyond where the pavement bends away. The markers look closer together from a distance, like they've edged inward over time. Once, at dusk, I thought I saw a faint flash on the surface of one, as if it had caught some light that didn't exist anywhere else around it. I don't map that road anymore, I don't write its numbers, I don't pretend it's just another stretch of county asphalt. It's a place that took the quiet, private fractures in my mind, the ones I could ignore when the world was loud enough, and handed them back to me in polished form, consecrated on reflective metal that will stand there long after I'm gone. You can live your whole life without ever wondering how thin the line is between who you are in your head, and who you seem to be on paper. Hollow route doesn't let you keep that distance. It measures you instead, and it doesn't bother telling you the final total. Some roads you drive, some roads you walk. And some roads walk you, inch by inch, toward a version of yourself you hope you never get the chance to meet. If you have ever driven home across some nearly forgotten American highway, after a long late shift, the kind where the dashboard glow feels like the only warm thing left in the world, and the night outside the windshield stretches out in a quiet, endless way, then you already understand the kind of tired that had settled into me that night. My name is Adam, and I was 22 years old the first time I took the hollow route. I wasn't new to late drives or lonely roads, I grew up among them, towns small enough that people waved even when they didn't remember your name, places where the convenience store closed at 9 and the rest of the town shut down with it. Back then I thought night driving held its own comfort, a kind of gentle isolation where no one needed anything from you for a while. That belief lasted right up until the night I learned some roads don't offer silence, they offer something that feels uncomfortably like attention. I had been working a late shift at the distribution center, the kind of warehouse built on a promise that never quite comes true, where bright fluorescent lights stay on long after the town around it has gone dark. A truck had come in behind schedule, and we spent an extra hour wrestling with boxes and pallets under buzzing lights that made the air feel thin. By the time I stepped out into the night, the sky was a dull stretch of cloud that looked like it had been wiped across the stars with the flat of a hand. My car, a worn '98 sedan that struggled through the winters but still carried the faint scent of my uncle's cigarettes, was waiting under a street lamp that flickered like it was trying to stay awake. I dropped into the driver's seat, let the engine groan awake, and traced the route home in my head, the long, safe way around, or the shortcut I had heard about in muttered break-room conversations that always ended with someone glancing toward the windows, as though checking whether the night was listening. Hollow route. That was the name the warehouse guys used, though no road sign had ever carried it. I had asked once why no one took it, and a coworker, a big man with quiet eyes, said, "Because we like getting home," in a tone that tried to sound joking but didn't quite make it. No one explained further, and I didn't press. Small towns have their own folklore, and most of it is told with the half-smile of people who don't want to admit they believe any of it. But now, with 1 in the morning creeping up on me and exhaustion settling low in my ribs, the idea of saving 15 minutes felt like a reasonable trade. The longer route had streetlights and familiar landmarks, but the shortcut was direct and simple, and at that hour, simplicity felt like a blessing. The turnoff lay just beyond the last yellow street lamp, marked by a fading green sign whose letters had long since been bleached into near invisibility. When I flicked on my blinker out of habit and eased the car onto that narrow 2-lane road, the change in atmosphere was immediate but subtle, like stepping into a room where a conversation had paused just before you entered. The hum of my engine took on a faint echo, the kind you hear when passing under a short bridge, though there was nothing overhead but branches leaning in from both sides. The air felt different too, dense in a way I couldn't articulate, as though sound itself didn't travel quite as far here. The first mile slipped by quietly. The trees pressed close to the shoulders, their branches ending in thin tangled silhouettes that caught bits of moonlight whenever the clouds shifted. The faded yellow centerline meandered through uneven patches of old pavement, but nothing about the drive felt dangerous, at least, not in any physical sense. Within a few minutes I saw the first mile marker on the right side of the road. 1.0, clean, newer than I had expected from a road that clearly hadn't seen frequent maintenance. The reflective green surface shone back at me with a sharpness that made it stand out from everything around it. Mile markers shouldn't draw your eye, but that one did. Only for a moment, though, and then it was gone behind me. A short distance later, I spotted the next one, 1.2. Not 1.1, 1.2. It was a small detail, but even small things can lodge in your thoughts on a dark road with no other distractions. I told myself I must have missed one. Maybe it had leaned too far back into the brush, or been knocked crooked by some storm. The explanation came too easily, the way excuses always do when you want them to. The radio crackled, losing its station entirely, and I turned it off to avoid the soft hiss of static filling the cabin. The road felt narrower the farther I went, though I couldn't see any change in its width. My headlights reached ahead in a pale cone, that cut the darkness into manageable pieces, and in that soft span of illuminated pavement, I caught sight of the third marker from far off. Its reflective surface shimmered in a way that made it seem as though it were trying to catch my attention before I reached it. I slowed down, not a decision, more like a reflex, because something in me already knew it would matter. 1.3, the numbers themselves weren't strange. It was the background, the green, where the wrongness lived. Highway signs are supposed to reflect light cleanly and evenly, but the surface of this one seemed to swallow a bit of the brightness before returning it, as though something beneath the flat sheet of metal wasn't entirely flat. The color felt deeper, layered almost. I leaned forward slightly, my breath fogging the inside of the windshield. I didn't want to look closer, but wanting and doing are different things. Behind the numbers, the green began to shift. Slowly, softly, like watching something appear through rising mist. Shapes resolved, a driveway, a mailbox dented on one side, the patch of yard where my brother and I had worn the grass thin during endless summers. The image had the washed-out quality of an old home video, flickering at the edges as though the sign wanted to hold the picture steady but wasn't built for it. Then I saw him. My younger brother stood beside the mailbox, hands in his hoodie pockets, shoulders drawn inward in that familiar way that always made him look halfway, between bored and worried. He had been dead for 3 years. The last time I saw him alive, he had waved me off with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes because I had told him I wasn't coming home that weekend. He died on a wet 2-lane road hours later. The guilt of that decision had never left me, but I had learned to carry it quietly, the way you tuck something sharp into a pocket so you can walk without bleeding too much. Now, through an impossible green window on a road I shouldn't have taken, he lifted his head and looked directly at me. Even distorted, his eyes had the same soft earnestness I remembered. The rest of the world dropped away in a slow, steady hush. My heart thudded in my chest, and the car drifted to nearly a crawl. His mouth moved. I couldn't hear anything, but grief doesn't need volume to be understood. Why weren't you there? It wasn't accusation, it wasn't anger. It was the raw, quiet question I had asked myself so many nights I'd lost count. It came through his expression like a crack in old glass, fragile and familiar. And then something behind him shifted. A taller figure, blurred, indistinct, hovered just at the edge of the scene, its outline wrong in a way I didn't know how to name. It leaned forward, its shape thickening in the green haze. A hand, or something shaped like a hand, rested on my brother's shoulder. The moment it touched him, the temperature in my car dropped sharply. My breath fogged the air. The dashboard lights flickered, the odometer flashed nonsense symbols. My brother's expression tensed. The figure behind him tilted its head, almost curious. Then the image vanished. The sign was just a sign again, flat, green, reflective, harmless. My headlights passed over it as though nothing had happened. But my hands were stiff on the steering wheel, and the silence in the car felt heavy enough to smell. I realized I had been holding my breath and let it out slowly, as the road widened and the trees thinned. The hollow route released me like something letting go of fabric it had been gripping. I don't remember the rest of the drive except for the strange disjointedness of the time. The dashboard said one thing, my phone another. The minutes didn't add up to the distance I had traveled. For a few days I tried to convince myself exhaustion had played a trick on me. That grief had bled into exhaustion and created something vivid enough to feel real. But the lie didn't settle. It hovered just out of reach, flimsy and unconvincing. I avoided the hollow route from that night on. I always took the long way home. I stopped asking the warehouse guys why they never used the shortcut, because I didn't want to hear the answer they might give if they stopped pretending not to believe in it. I still don't know what the road showed me that night. A memory? A hallucination? Something wearing my brother's shape the way the dark sometimes wears familiar silhouettes just to keep you looking a moment too long. What I do know is that some roads don't measure distance, they measure something else entirely. They wait, they listen, they look for whatever weakness you've been trying to bury, and when you're tired enough, alone enough, and the night is quiet enough, they show it back to you in a way you can't deny. And if you ever find yourself on an empty stretch of highway with the urge to save a few minutes, by taking a shortcut someone in town warned you about, do yourself a kindness. Take the longer route. Let the mile markers stay exactly where they are in your mind. Because once you've looked into the green face of a sign that knows what you've been carrying, you don't forget it, not ever. There are nights when the road feels less like something built for travel and more like a long, quiet question you've accidentally agreed to answer. I learned that on the hollow route the night my car died just past the midpoint, at a place locals don't like naming directly. I had finished a 13-hour shift at the county hospital, the kind of shift that leaves your thoughts drifting at odd angles, your limbs heavy, and your patience so thin that even the weight of your own keys in your hand feels like too much. Walking to the parking lot through the dim glow of the security lights, I told myself I'd take the normal route home, the one that curled through town and past the diner. But when I reached the highway I realized I didn't have it in me to spend an extra 20 minutes, listening to a stale radio playlist and watching the same old storefronts slide past. The hollow route would cut the drive in half. I'd never taken it before, but I'd lived in this part of the state long enough to know its reputation, odd, vague, nothing concrete enough to count as a warning. And that night, exhaustion outweighed caution. The turnoff appeared like a crease in the landscape, a thin two-lane road diving into heavier trees than anywhere else around. The moment my tires crossed onto it, I felt a faint shift in the air pressure inside the car, so subtle I wasn't sure if it was real or one of those strange sensations that come after too many hours breathing recycled hospital air. The radio lost its clarity, voices blurred into static and then into nothing. I shut it off and tried to focus on the narrow ribbon of pavement ahead, its faded centerline guiding me deeper into a corridor of branches that seemed to lean closer with every passing yard. My headlights carved out a small bright world in front of me, but everything beyond that glow felt muted and strangely distant, as if the road wasn't cutting through the landscape but sliding under it. I remember checking the dashboard clock and realizing, I had no sense of how long I'd been driving. The road had no turns, no landmarks beyond the occasional reflective marker, no sense of progression at all. That should have made the route feel shorter, but instead it stretched out into a quiet that pressed against me like a weight. I took a slow breath, blinked hard to clear the fog of fatigue, and reached for the coffee tumbler I always kept in the cup holder. My fingers brushed it, then stopped. At that exact moment the engine made a soft choking sound and went still. Not a stall, not a sputter. It simply stopped. Every light on the dashboard dimmed in one slow sigh. The air system died, the fan went quiet. Only the faint residual hum of cooling metal remained. I guided the car to the shoulder, though it felt as if the vehicle had already surrendered all authority to the road itself. When I tried the ignition, nothing responded. The second attempt gave a weak click, but that was all. I sat there for a moment with my hands still gripping the wheel, staring at the dim outline of trees ahead, refusing to acknowledge the single thought rising through me: I had broken down on the hollow route, at night, alone. I reached for my phone to call roadside assistance, but the screen flashed and then went dark. Battery was full when I left work. Now it wouldn't even give me the courtesy of a boot screen. I tried again, pressing harder as if that made any difference, but the device stayed lifeless. Even the emergency power symbol didn't appear. I looked out the windshield, then into the rearview mirror, hoping to see the glow of another car approaching or some distant light flickering between the trees. The darkness held steady, thick and unmoving. I had never seen darkness hold still like that before. A cold feeling settled into my stomach, but I forced myself to breathe slowly. People broke down on roads all over the country every day. I'd walked farther distances for help. There was nothing inherently threatening about the situation, no reason to let imagination run ahead of reason. But even as I tried to speak those reassuring thoughts into the quiet, I felt something unsettling underneath them, something subtle but unmistakably present, the sense that the road was listening. I grabbed my jacket, stepped out into the night, and shut the door behind me. The air felt colder than it should have for that time of year, sharp enough to sting the inside of my nose. The only sound was the distant rustle of branches, though even that seemed to come in slow intervals, like the wind was hesitating before moving through the trees. I looked ahead and behind, weighing my options. I could stay with the car and wait for another driver to come along, but I hadn't seen a single set of headlights since turning onto the hollow route. Or I could walk, hope the road eventually reached a house or crossed into better reception. The idea of walking that silent stretch didn't appeal to me, but the idea of waiting in the dark car felt worse. So I started walking. The pavement under my boots felt slightly slick, as though the cold had pulled moisture from the air. Each step echoed faintly, too faintly, as if the sound didn't travel beyond the reach of my own body. I kept my gaze fixed ahead, letting my eyes adjust to the thin light the sky offered. The trees seemed to crowd closer the farther I went, their trunks bending in a way that gave the impression of faces leaning toward the road, watching without making themselves known. I tried not to look too long at them, choosing instead to focus on the white line at the edge of the pavement. It was the only thing that felt steady. After what felt like several minutes of walking, I saw a faint glint of something metallic up ahead. Relief flickered through me at the thought of another car, or maybe a mailbox marking the edge of a property. But as I approached, the shape resolved into the familiar outline of a mile marker. 1.0, the number stood clean and bright against the green background, its surface reflecting the faintest shimmer of moonlight. Something about that bothered me. I had driven farther than this earlier, hadn't I? I had passed the 1.0 marker already. I was sure of it, yet here it was again, as crisp and certain as if it had never been anywhere else. I slowed but didn't stop. I told myself exhaustion was playing with my memory, that maybe I'd mistaken where I broke down. The road could have curved without me noticing, but the unease in my chest grew heavier, settling into a slow pulse that matched the rhythm of my footsteps. Another few minutes passed, then another glint ahead. Another marker. 1.0 again. I stopped walking. The night around me felt thicker suddenly, as though the trees themselves were drawing a slow breath. I turned around to face the path I'd come from, hoping the distance would give me some sense of orientation. The road behind me stretched like a dark ribbon, smooth and unbroken. And halfway down that ribbon stood the same 1.0 marker, though I hadn't passed it after turning. There should have been nothing there. I stepped backward, never taking my eyes off the sign. It didn't move, it didn't flicker, it simply remained, steady and wrong. When I forced myself to turn back again, the forest seemed closer. The branches overhead arched in a way I didn't remember from before, knitting together just enough to dim the sky further. I took a slow breath and tried to keep my thoughts rational. Roads don't duplicate themselves, signs don't multiply. This was stress, or fatigue, or something else that at least had a reasonable explanation. But logic felt thin out here, as if the rules didn't reach far enough into this stretch of land. I kept walking. Eventually the marker ahead changed. 1.2, my pulse jumped, because that meant I had moved forward, not in circles. But something about the sign's angle felt off, tilted slightly toward the road, like someone had pressed it down on one side. When I reached it, I hesitated. A faint mark in the dirt caught my eye. A footprint, not mine. The direction it pointed made my skin crawl. It faced the marker, not the road. I stepped away from it and forced myself not to stare too long. I kept walking, but every few yards I felt the unmistakable sensation of being observed, as though something just at the edge of the tree line paced me, matching my steps without making a sound. Several times I glanced sideways, expecting to catch movement, but the darkness between the trunks remained still, too still, like a photograph pressed against the night. When the 1.3 marker appeared, it felt like a shift in temperature. The air grew colder, the silence deeper. The sign stood a little crooked, its surface glinting faintly in the dim light. I stopped in front of it because I couldn't not stop. Something about it demanded attention, not visually, not audibly, but in a quiet pressure that pushed up from the ground through the soles of my boots. There was a faint shape on the metal, just under the reflective numbers. At first I thought it was dirt or a shadow, but when I leaned closer, I realized the surface was reflecting something that wasn't present anywhere around me. A table, a chair, a thin hospital blanket with a crease I recognized too well. I blinked hard, once, twice. The image sharpened. It was the room where my father had died. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. The sign didn't change. The reflection held steady, the room lit in that too bright fluorescent way hospital rooms always are at night. And in the corner of the reflection stood a figure, slender, unmoving, head tilted in a quiet, patient angle. I could not see its face, I did not want to. I turned and began walking, slowly at first, then faster, then as fast as my tired legs would allow. I didn't look back, I didn't check for the markers. I fixed my eyes on the center of the road and walked until the trees thinned, and the night finally loosened its grip. When I reached the edge of town, my phone vibrated to life in my pocket as though nothing had happened. The battery was still full. I never walked that road again. I don't drive it, I don't even take the highway near the turnoff unless daylight is strong enough to reassure me that the shadows don't have intentions of their own. Because something lives in the space between those mile markers, something that knows what memory to show you, what room to summon, what moment to pull from the quiet part of your chest where grief settles like sediment. Something that waits for you to step into a night when you're tired enough, lonely enough, or unlucky enough to give it exactly what it wants. And if you ever break down on the hollow route, don't start walking. Not there, not alone, not at night. You have been listening to The Whispering Hour. Before you drift back into the dark, let me know in the comments where you're listening from, and which moment stayed with you the longest. Your whispers guide the night still waiting to unfold. Sleep well, if you can.